32-year-old Elena Sterling stood beneath the vibrating crystal chandeliers of the Drake Hotel as her brother prepared to publicly erase her. 16 years ago, I gave you a choice to leave with dignity, and tonight, I'm making sure you leave with the police. Julian sneered into the microphone, his $85,000 Patek Philippe flashing before 300 silent guests. The ballroom smelled of expensive truffles and lilies, a clinical backdrop for my social execution. I didn't cry. I simply adjusted my silver heirloom brooch and watched the frantic pulse in his neck. Your empire is gone. What happened next is a debt 16 years in the making that I am finally here to collect. The architecture of the Sterling Manor on Chicago's North Shore was designed to dwarf human emotion. 14,000 square feet of cold limestone and tempered glass that cost my father $12.5 million to build and me my childhood to inhabit. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., the heavy mahogany dining table became a tactical map for the family hierarchy. My father, Arthur Sterling, sat at the head, his presence a suffocating weight of expectations and silent judgments. Julian was always at his right hand, already wearing $200 hand-burnished Italian leather loafers at 17, embodying the predatory grace of a successor in waiting. I was relegated to the far end, exactly 8 feet from the service door, positioned where the light from the chandeliers barely reached. The air always smelled of expensive Arabica coffee and heavy starch, a clinical scent that masked the rot of exclusion. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was merely a rounding error in a grander equation of legacy. Invisibility in our household wasn't a passive state. It was a deliberate atmospheric pressure maintained by those who held the checkbook. When I placed my first-place regional mathematics trophy on the marble sideboard, Julian didn't argue. He simply moved it 3 inches to the left to make room for his varsity rowing plaque. No one spoke. The rhythmic clink of sterling silver against fine bone china was the only soundtrack to my erasure. My mother, draped in $40,000 of South Sea pearls, would stare at the manicured gardens as if looking for an escape route she couldn't afford. Occasionally, she would press a crisp and secret $50 bill into my palm, the only thing she ever truly gave me, as a bribe for my continued silence. But Aunt Sophia was the only one who truly saw the mechanics of the room. She sat in her velvet armchair, her $15,000 Cartier watch ticking with the surgical precision of a heart monitor, watching Julian's every move. Julian's internal logic was as rigid as the steel beams of the skyscrapers he intended to inherit, believing that a family empire required a singular, unsharpened point. In his mind, my existence was a structural flaw that needed to be paved over for the sake of the Sterling name. He walked the halls with the measured stride of a man who already owned the oxygen in the room, justifying his early $450,000 embezzlement trail as a necessary management fee for his future brilliance. While he practiced his signature on Father's letterhead in the library, I was in the attic with Aunt Sophia, learning a different language. She taught me to find the stories hidden within the margins of bank statements and ledger entries. One evening, she pinned a silver heirloom brooch to my lapel, the same one I hold now, and told me that the loudest men are usually building on sand. At 16, I was learning to count every cent Julian thought he had successfully stolen. November 14, 2010 was a Sunday, and at precisely 11:14 p.m., the temperature on the North Shore dropped to 34 degrees as a sleet-heavy gale rattled the $200,000 stained glass windows of the foyer. My father had been in the ground for exactly 72 hours when Julian stood beneath the portraits of 3 generations of Sterlings, holding a single sheet of cream-colored stationery that purportedly stripped me of my 50% inheritance. He looked at me with the surgical detachment of a landlord evicting a tenant who had defaulted on a lease, his voice devoid of any fraternal resonance. "The estate doesn't recognize a rounding error as a beneficiary, Elena," he said, his fingers tracing the gold-embossed crest at the top of the forged document. I watched the way his pupils didn't dilate, a biological confirmation that he felt no remorse for the $625 million he was currently vacuuming out of my future. I didn't scream or beg for the warmth of the 14,000-square-foot sanctuary. I simply memorized the exact angle of his smirk. My mother stood on the second-floor landing, her silhouette framed by the $45,000 Italian marble balustrade, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her silk robe. She didn't descend to intervene as Julian shoved my threadbare duffel bag toward the heavy oak door. Instead, she waited until he turned his back to press a single, crisp $50 bill into my palm, the price of her continued comfort in a house built on my exclusion. Aunt Sophia was the only one who moved with intent, stepping from the shadows of the library to pin the silver heirloom brooch to my thin denim jacket. Knowledge is the only currency they can't devalue, she whispered, her eyes reflecting the clinical precision of the $15,000 Cartier watch on her wrist. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain at 11:28 p.m., the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing like a gavel in the silence of the North Shore. I didn't look back at the limestone fortress. I had already begun calculating the interest on his debt. The Greyhound station on Harrison Street smelled of burnt diesel, floor wax, and the collective desperation of people with nowhere else to go. I sat on a hard plastic bench at 2:14 a.m., the $50 bill folded neatly in my pocket, and the silver brooch cold against my chest, watching the flickering fluorescent lights hum in a rhythmic B-flat. While other teenagers were dreaming of Ivy League admissions and heated bedrooms, I was transforming my heart into a cold, immutable spreadsheet, categorizing every humiliation into a column of future liabilities. The $12.5 million estate felt like a distant planet, but the weathered black leather audit case I had taken from Father's study felt like a weapon in my lap. I didn't cry when the bus to nowhere hissed at the platform. I simply opened the first ledger and began to trace the $450,000 discrepancy Julian thought I was too young to notice. That night, I stopped being a daughter and became a witness to the fraud that would eventually dismantle his entire world. The basement apartment on West Polk Street smelled of damp concrete and cheap detergent, a $650 a month sanctuary where the radiator hissed at 4:15 a.m. every winter morning. I didn't reach out to the North Shore. I existed in the margins of the city, working 3 jobs while my fingers stayed stained with the blue ink of ledger entries. My mother's single $50 bill sat inside a $4 plastic frame on my scarred plywood desk, a constant, silent reminder that my value in her eyes was a fixed, negligible cost. I survived on generic protein bars and lukewarm tap water. My world reduced to the linoleum where I mapped out the first outlines of my new identity. There were nights when the cold seeped into my marrow and the temptation to crawl back to the limestone gates almost won. But then I would look at the silver brooch on my nightstand. It didn't offer comfort. It offered the cold, hard clarity of a debt that remained unpaid. By 2016, the weathered black leather audit case I had taken from my father's study had become my most intimate companion, its seams holding the growing weight of my observations. I spent my nights in the university library, the only student who studied the $450,000 embezzlement trail Julian had left behind, with the intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate heart transplant. I learned that money doesn't just move, it leaves a heat signature, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that arrogant men like my brother assume are beneath notice. My professors saw a dedicated student, but the internal camera of my mind saw a forensic architect dismantling a fortress brick by invisible brick. I didn't care about the $12.5 million estate or the social standing that came with the Sterling name. I cared about the mathematical proof of a lie. Every spreadsheet I built was a silent promise to the girl at the Greyhound station that the truth would eventually demand its full seat at the table. A week before my graduation from the forensic accounting program, a certified envelope arrived from a law firm in Zurich, containing a single key and a letter from Aunt Sophia dated 3 years before her passing. She hadn't left me a fortune that would make me soft. She had left me a $25,000 restricted trust intended solely for the certification of reality. The letter was clinical, written with the same precision as the $15,000 Cartier watch she always wore, explaining that she had seen Julian's hand trembling over the original will long before he ever moved to forge it. She told me that power isn't found in what you own, but in what you can prove about those who think they own everything. I used that money to hire the private investigators who could bypass the $200,000 security systems of Sterling Development, gathering the raw data that no one else could see. Sophia's legacy wasn't a gift. It was a tactical reinforcement sent from the past. My entry into the Department of Justice as a forensic auditor was not a stroke of luck, but the result of a 5-year campaign where I refined my ability to see through the $85,000 Patek Philippe facade. I became the person who sits in windowless rooms at 11:45 p.m., tracing the flow of capital through shell companies that smell of offshore tax havens and desperation. My colleagues knew me as Agent Sterling, the one who never blinked when confronted with high-net-worth arrogance or threats of political retaliation from the city's elite. I didn't need the $200 Italian loafers Julian favored. I needed the $2,500 specialized software that could flag a single suspicious transaction across 3 continents in less than 4 seconds. While my brother was busy being photographed at charity galas, I was documenting the exact moment he began laundering $2.4 million through a fraudulent construction project in the South Side. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply performing a long overdue audit on a bankrupt soul. The irony of our connection began to crystallize during the investigation into Project Zenith, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment scheme that Julian touted as his crowning achievement to the Chicago press. He had no way of knowing that the quiet auditor assigned to the Federal Oversight Committee was the sister he had discarded like a rounding error 16 years ago. As I reviewed the $1.8 million in kickbacks paid to offshore accounts, I noticed the same patterns of forgery he had used on our father's will, a signature of greed that was as unique and identifiable as a digital fingerprint. He was building his empire on the very ground I was meticulously deconstructing from a government office 3 miles away, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that his auditor was his primary victim. I watched his televised interviews where he spoke of legacy and strength, noting the texture of the $12,000 suit he wore while I signed the subpoenas that would eventually strip him. By the time the 30th anniversary gala of Sterling Development was announced, the trap was not just set, it was mathematically inevitable, a logical conclusion to a decade of silent observation. I stood in my modest apartment, looking at the silver heirloom brooch and the framed $50 bill, calculating the final interest on the $12.5 million debt Julian owed to the truth. The city's elite were preparing their tuxedos and gowns, unaware that the guest of honor was actually a ghost who had learned to speak the language of federal statutes and seizure warrants. I didn't feel anger or the heat of impending triumph. I felt the cool, sterile satisfaction of a completed equation where all variables finally aligned. Julian believed he was at the peak of his power, but the internal camera of my life showed him standing on a precipice of his own making, held up by nothing but the air of his own lies. I prepared my weathered black leather audit case, knowing the audit was finally over. The Gold Coast room of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of manufactured prestige, where the 400 per plate dinner smelled faintly of truffles and the desperate ambition of Chicago's middle-tier elite. I moved through the crowd with the calculated anonymity of a shadow, my $300 charcoal blazer a stark, I know, that away. Functional contrast to the $15,000 couture gowns fluttering like expensive moths around the open bar. At precisely 8:14 p.m., the temperature in the room seemed to settle into a static, pressurized humidity, the kind that precedes a structural failure in a high-rise building. I didn't reach for the vintage Krug champagne being circulated on silver trays. Instead, I felt the familiar weight of the weathered black leather audit case tucked securely under my arm. My eyes, trained by a decade of federal oversight, mapped the exits and the positions of the private security guards, noting the exact $2,500 difference between their standard-issue footwear and the guest list's luxury. I was a ghost in their machine. Julian stood at the center of a circle of venture capitalists, his $85,000 Patek Philippe catching the overhead light with a brilliance that was almost violent in its ostentation. He was holding court with the practiced ease of a man who believed that his $1.8 billion portfolio was a legitimate substitute for a conscience or a soul. Every few seconds, he would perform a sharp, percussive laugh that sounded like dry wood snapping in a fireplace, a sound that signaled his absolute dominance over the conversation. His internal logic was on full display. He truly believed that the $2.4 million he had diverted into Project Zenith was not a crime, but a visionary's tax on the stagnant. I observed the way his left eyelid flickered, a micro-expression of anxiety that only someone who had spent 5 years studying his deposition videos would ever recognize. He was a king standing on a throne built of $450,000 in unrecorded liabilities. My mother, Lydia, was positioned exactly 6 feet to his left, her $40,000 South Sea pearls gleaming against her throat like a row of cold, white teeth. She was nursing a glass of sparkling water, her gaze fixed on the $200,000 floral arrangements as if she could find a hidden exit strategy among the imported white hydrangeas. When our eyes met for a fraction of a second, I saw the same trembling hesitation that had defined the night of the November storm 16 years ago. She didn't offer a greeting or even a nod of recognition. She simply tightened her grip on her $8,000 Chanel clutch, her silence a clinical confirmation of her status as Julian's primary enabler. The memory of that single, framed $50 bill in my apartment flashed through my mind, a pathetic bribe for a daughter's erasure that was now worth exactly zero in the current economy of my life. She was a fading portrait. The transition from observation to confrontation occurred at 9:02 p.m., when Julian finally registered my presence near the service corridor, his face hardening into a mask of aristocratic disdain. He didn't approach me with anger. He moved with the measured, predatory pace of a landlord who had discovered a persistent pest in a high-rent district. The crowd parted instinctively, Sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure as the CEO of Sterling Development stood 3 feet away from the sister he had presumed dead or forgotten, I noted the smell of his $400 cologne, sandalwood, and arrogance, and the way he adjusted his French cuffs with a precision that was meant to intimidate the $12.5 million estate's former heir. He looked at my worn audit case as if it were a biohazard, his pupils constricting into 2 sharp points of pure, unadulterated malice. The silence between us was a $12.5 million vacuum that no one in the room dared to fill. It was absolute. You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Elena, but trespassing at a corporate milestone is a new low even for a rounding error, he said, his voice carrying the cold resonance of a judge delivering a predetermined sentence. He wasn't speaking to me. He was performing for the donors and the press, reinforcing the narrative that I was a liability he had rightfully purged from the Sterling lineage. His internal logic demanded that I be seen as a failure, a ghost who had returned to beg for the crumbs of his $1.8 billion success. He leaned in closer, the $85,000 Patek Philippe ticking like a countdown between us, and whispered that my presence was an insult to the limestone walls our father had built. I didn't flinch or look away. I simply recorded the 112 beats per minute visible in his carotid artery, a biological sign of the fear he was desperately trying to mask with his $12,000 charcoal suit. The final line was crossed when Julian signaled for the head of security, a man wearing a $2,500 suit that didn't quite hide the tactical holster on his hip. Julian turned back to the room, raising his voice so that even the staff in the kitchen could hear his public declaration of my total worthlessness. 16 years ago, I gave you a choice to leave with dignity, and tonight, I'm making sure you leave with the police, he announced, his smirk reflecting the same predatory satisfaction I had memorized at the Greyhound station. He mentioned the November storm not as a trauma, but as a necessary reorganization of the family's human capital, a clinical rebranding of the night he stole my $625 million inheritance. The crowd began to murmur, their $5,000 suits rustling with the excitement of witnessing a high society execution. I felt the sharp edge of the silver brooch through my blazer, a cold anchor in the storm of his lies. In that moment, the silence that had been my primary defense mechanism for a decade began to feel like a suffocating weight, a cage I had outgrown the second I signed my first DOJ seizure warrant. I looked at Julian and saw not a powerful tycoon, but a desperate forger who was one audit away from a federal penitentiary and a total collapse of his $1.8 billion facade. The internal camera of my mind captured the precise angle of his chin, the smug confidence in his eyes, and the way his hand trembled as he reached for a fresh glass of champagne. He thought he was winning a public argument, but I knew he was merely providing the opening statement for his own prosecution in a room full of witnesses. I shifted the weight of the weathered black leather audit case, feeling the texture of the $2.4 million laundering evidence that would soon turn his champagne to ash. The decision was no longer a strategy. I thought of Aunt Sophia's $15,000 Cartier watch and the way she had taught me to find the truth hidden in the margins of a spreadsheet while Julian was practicing his forged signature. She had seen the rot in the Sterling Foundation long before the first limestone block was ever laid, and she had spent her final years preparing a tactical strike from the grave. The silver heirloom brooch on my lapel wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the physical manifestation of a legacy that valued reality over the $45,000 marble balustrades of our childhood home. Julian believed he had erased her influence when he burned her letters, but he didn't realize that her real message was encoded in the $25,000 trust she had left for my forensic education. I was the weapon she had forged in secret, a clinical instrument of justice designed to dismantle a world built on the theft of a sister's future. The audit was final. The room seemed to expand as I stepped away from the service exit and into the center of the stage's light, the $15,000 couture gowns and $200 Italian loafers becoming a blurred background to the clarity of my purpose. The security guard hesitated, his $2,500 suit stiffening as he saw the lack of fear in my eyes, a biological anomaly in a room where everyone was terrified of Julian's $1.8 billion influence. I could feel the collective breath of the Chicago elite being held, a $12.5 million silence that waited for the next movement in this tragic family opera. Julian's smirk began to falter, replaced by a twitch in his jaw that signaled his brain was finally beginning to process the anomaly of my calm. He had expected a victim who would beg for mercy or hide in the shadows of the North Shore, but he was facing a federal auditor who had already mapped his descent. The atmospheric pressure was reaching its breaking point. At precisely 9:42 p.m., I reached into the weathered black leather audit case and pulled out a single cream-colored document, the same stationery Julian had used 16 years ago to forge our father's will and steal my life. The light from the $200,000 chandeliers reflected off the silver heirloom brooch, casting a sharp, metallic glint into Julian's eyes that made him blink for the first time in our confrontation. He opened his mouth to order my arrest, but the words died in his throat as he saw the seal of the Department of Justice and the federal marshals appearing at the ballroom's main entrance. I didn't look at the police or the terrified crowd. I looked directly at the brother who had abandoned me in a storm and saw the exact moment he realized his empire was built on sand. I leaned forward, my voice a clinical, cold whisper that carried the weight of 16 years of silent calculation. "Julian," I said, "your audit has just begun." The heavy brass doors of the Gold Coast room didn't just open at 9:43 p.m. They surrendered to the clinical authority of 4 federal marshals whose $150 nylon windbreakers sliced through the $5,000 tuxedos like a scalpel through silk. The rhythmic clink of champagne flutes stopped instantly, replaced by the heavy, tactical thud of government-issue boots on the $300,000 Axminster carpet. Julian's hand froze mid-air, his $85,000 Patek Philippe catching a stray beam of light that seemed to expose the sudden, frantic pulse in his wrist. He looked at the lead agent not with the outrage of an innocent man, but with the calculated panic of a forger who had finally run out of ink. I stood exactly 3 feet away, the silver heirloom brooch on my lapel reflecting the cold neon of the marshal's badges, my weathered black leather audit case now resting on the edge of the mahogany stage. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted from high society celebration to the sterile, pressurized silence of a federal crime scene. The lead marshal didn't look at the $200,000 floral arrangements or the terrified faces of the Chicago elite. He looked directly at my brother and produced a single, blue-backed document that bore the crimson seal of the Department of Justice. As he began reading the seizure warrant, the words laundering, wire fraud, and Project Zenith echoed through the ballroom with the finality of a closing cell door. Julian's internal logic, which had sustained his $1.8 billion facade for 16 years, began to visibly fragment as the marshal detailed the $2.4 million in kickbacks I had meticulously traced back to his personal offshore accounts. He tried to speak, to invoke the sterling name or the $12.5 million estate's influence, but his voice was a thin, dry rasp that couldn't penetrate the clinical weight of the evidence. I watched the way his $12,000 charcoal suit suddenly seemed 2 sizes too large for a man who was discovering that his entire empire was merely a temporary loan from the truth. The most visceral inversion of status occurred when the second marshal stepped forward and requested the immediate surrender of all Sterling Development assets, beginning with the $85,000 Patek Philippe on Julian's trembling arm. The room watched in a collective, $12.5 million paralysis as the watch was unbuckled, a symbolic amputation of the time Julian thought he had stolen from me 16 years ago. Then came the $250,000 Bentley keys, handed over with a mechanical jerk that signaled the total collapse of his predatory grace. I noted the way his $200 hand-burnished Italian loafers seemed to lose their grip on the marble floor, his posture wilting under the weight of 300 witnesses who were already mentally erasing him from their social calendars. The internal camera of my mind recorded the exact moment he realized that the rounding error he had discarded at the Greyhound station was now the federal auditor signing his financial death warrant. He wasn't a tycoon anymore. He was a liability in a tuxedo. I reached for the silver heirloom brooch on my lapel, my fingers finding the hidden catch that Aunt Sophia had shown me in the attic a decade ago, revealing the small, intricately carved key hidden within its housing. I placed the original, untampered will of Arthur Sterling, the one Julian thought he had burned in the library furnace, directly onto the podium, the cream-colored stationery smelling of old cedar and Sophia's clinical foresight. The audit didn't just find the money, Julian. It found the soul you tried to forge, I said, my voice a calm, B-flat resonance that required no microphone to reach every corner of the silent ballroom. The document, witnessed by Sophia and held in a Swiss vault for 16 years, clearly stated that the $12.5 million estate and the company were to be split 50-50, contingent on a clean forensic audit. By stealing my half and forging the rest, he hadn't secured his legacy. He had triggered a total forfeiture of his own. The elite guests, who had spent the evening basking in Julian's manufactured warmth, began to withdraw with the synchronized precision of a receding tide, leaving him isolated on the stage. My mother, Lydia, clutched her $40,000 South Sea pearls so tightly that the string snapped, the white spheres scattering across the floor like the fragments of a broken promise. She looked at the federal marshals and then at me, her eyes searching for a daughter she hadn't spoken to in 16 years, but she only found the cold, professional gaze of Agent Sterling. There were no tears in my eyes, only the $450,000 embezzlement trail and the 11:14 p.m. temperature of that November storm stored in the spreadsheets of my memory. The power in the room had moved from the man who owned the limestone walls to the woman who understood exactly how they were financed. Julian's empire wasn't being taken by force. It was being reclaimed by the sheer, immutable weight of reality. Julian's face turned a translucent, waxy gray as the marshals informed him that he was being taken into federal custody for the $2.4 million laundering scheme. His $1.8 billion net worth now a collection of frozen assets and seizure tags. He looked at the original will on the podium, his fingers twitching as if he still believed a forged signature could rewrite 16 years of documented fraud. "I was protecting the name, Elena. I was making us relevant," he whispered, a desperate appeal to a family logic that had died the moment he closed the deadbolt at the North Shore Manor. I didn't offer him the satisfaction of an argument or the heat of a vengeful retort. I simply adjusted the silver brooch on my blazer and observed the way his $12,000 suit looked under the harsh, clinical light of the marshal's flashlights. He had spent his life building a fortress of lies, never realizing that the truth doesn't need to attack. It only needs to exist. At precisely 9:58 p.m., as the marshals began to escort Julian toward the service exit he had tried to consign me to, I felt the final piece of the $12.5 million equation click into place. The silver brooch felt warm against my chest, a physical confirmation that Aunt Sophia's certification of reality was now the only law governing the Sterling name. I looked out over the ballroom, noting the $15,000 couture gowns and the $200,000 floral arrangements that would be auctioned off by the federal government within the next 48 hours. Julian looked back one last time, his eyes wide with the realization that I wasn't the ghost of his past, but the architect of his future. I didn't wave or speak. I just stood with my spine erect and my hands still, watching the brother who had made me invisible become the most conspicuous failure in the history of the city. The audit of Julian Sterling was officially closed, and for the first time in 16 years, the books were perfectly balanced. The sunrise over Lake Michigan at 6:12 a.m. the following Tuesday was a pale, antiseptic yellow that offered no warmth to the 14,000-square-foot limestone shell of the Sterling Manor. For the first time in 16 years, the $12.5 million estate felt like a collection of depreciating assets rather than a fortress of familial power. I sat in the formal dining room, the same 8 feet from the service door where I once stood in silence, now holding a federal inventory sheet that listed every $200,000 stained glass window as a line item for liquidation. The smell of expensive Arabica coffee had been replaced by the scent of industrial floor wax and the static charge of active laser scanners used by the seizure team. I didn't feel the heat of victory. I felt the cool, rhythmic pulse of a spreadsheet reaching its final equilibrium. The silence was no longer a cage of my invisibility. It was the quietude of an audit that had finally found its missing variables. By 10:45 a.m., the first of 24 specialized crates arrived to begin the removal of the $1.8 billion collection of contemporary art Julian had used as collateral for his fraudulent loans. I watched from the second-floor gallery as the $45,000 Italian marble balustrade was padded with industrial foam, a clinical protection for a structure that was no longer ours. The atmospheric pressure of the house had shifted from suffocating to sterile. As the DOJ contractors moved with the mechanical efficiency of termites, dismantling a rotten tree, my mother sat in the solarium, her hands empty of the $40,000 South Sea pearls, watching the movers as if they were ghosts, taking away her only identity. She didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with the vacant, uncomprehending stare of a passenger on a sinking ship who had forgotten how to swim. Her $8,000 Chanel clutch lay forgotten on a side table, a useless accessory in a world where the currency had changed. The afternoon press cycle at 2:30 p.m. transformed the Sterling name from a social gold standard into a toxic liability that the city's elite dropped with the speed of a falling market. Julian's face was frozen in a pixelated $12,000 scowl on every news site, his $85,000 Patek Philippe highlighted by red circles as the primary symbol of his $2.4 million laundering scheme. The venture capitalists who had toasted his vision at the gala were now issuing clinical statements of deep concern and total lack of prior knowledge through their 1,000 an hour PR firms. I sat in my temporary office at the DOJ, reviewing the 400 pages of the formal indictment, noting how the $450,000 embezzlement trail from our father's estate had served as the foundation for every subsequent lie. He wasn't being dismantled by my hands. He was being crushed by the cumulative weight of the numbers he had tried to ignore for 16 years. The audit was simply the catalyst for his inevitable structural collapse. Julian's first bail hearing at 4 p.m. was a study in the rapid depreciation of human capital, held in a courtroom that smelled of damp wool and old wood. He sat behind the defense table in a $250 off-the-rack suit provided by his public defender, his $12,000 bespoke wardrobe having been seized along with his $250,000 Bentley. The predatory grace he had displayed at the gala was gone, replaced by a twitch in his left shoulder that betrayed a nervous system struggling to process a $12.5 million loss. He didn't look at the judge with the arrogance of a Sterling. He looked at the wooden gavel as if it were a tactical weapon. The judge, whose $150 robes were the only authority in the room, denied bail with a clinical, dry rasp that sounded exactly like the Greyhound station's gate at 2:14 a.m. I sat in the third row, the silver heirloom brooch hidden beneath my lapel, recording the 120 beats per minute visible in his neck. The following weeks were a tactical reorganization of my own reality, as the $12.5 million estate transitioned from a crime scene to a federal seizure asset under my supervision. My mother, Lydia, began to call my office at exactly 10:14 a.m. every morning, her voice a thin, vibrating frequency of misplaced entitlement and sudden, desperate humility. She didn't ask about the $2.4 million laundering scheme or the $450,000 embezzlement Julian had committed against me. She asked about the $40,000 South Sea pearls. I responded with the clinical precision of a federal auditor, informing her that every item purchased with stolen funds was now the property of the government. I felt no satisfaction in her displacement. I simply felt the cool, sterile clarity of a debt that had finally reached its maturity date. She wasn't my mother in those calls. She was a witness to a fraud who was realizing that her $8,000 Chanel bag was a liability in the new economy. By 3 p.m. on a rainy Thursday, Julian was moved from the high-security hold to a state penitentiary to await trial. His $1.8 billion facade replaced by a $12 orange jumpsuit and a standard-issue plastic mattress. He wrote me a letter on lined yellow paper, the ink smudging under the pressure of his frustration, demanding that I fix this for the sake of the family name. His internal logic was still trapped in the 14,000-square-foot limestone mansion, believing that the rules of the North Shore could still be bought with a $12.5 million promise. He didn't understand that the name was already a radioactive brand, a $450,000 hole in the city's financial credibility that no one was willing to fill. I read the letter in my office at the DOJ, noting the $2.4 million in kickbacks he had failed to mention, and then I filed it in the evidence locker. He wasn't my brother. He was a defendant whose $85,000 Patek Philippe was now in an evidence bag, the Sterling Manors Library. Once the site of my father's $12.5 million silence and Julian's practice of forgery was repurposed as the headquarters for the Sterling Foundation by late October. I spent my evenings there, surrounded by the $200,000 stained glass windows, drafting the bylaws for a nonprofit that would serve as a sanctuary for displaced youth. The mahogany tables were covered with $2,500 architectural plans for the dormitory conversion. The smell of expensive Arabica coffee, replaced by the scent of fresh paint and possibility. I didn't feel the heat of revenge. I felt the cool, methodical satisfaction of a structural repair to a foundation that had been broken for 16 years. The $450,000 Julian had stolen was being returned to the community in the form of scholarships and mental health support, a clinical redistribution of stolen capital. I was no longer a rounding error in a grand equation. I was the auditor of a new, transparent legacy. Have you ever stood in the ruins of your own childhood and felt nothing but the calm, clinical relief of an audit finally coming to its end? I look at the $50 bill in the plastic frame on my desk, a pathetic bribe from a mother who chose the $12.5 million limestone walls over her own daughter. I know many of you have felt that same invisibility, that same cold, 11:14 p.m. sleet that comes when the people who should love you decide you're a rounding error in their life. But I want you to tell me in the comments, what was the moment you realized that your value wasn't determined by their checkbook? What was the moment you decided to start your own internal audit of the truth? Your stories are the currency that actually matters in a world built on $1.8 billion lies. The best part of this story is just beginning, and I want you to be part of the final balance. The elite social circle of Chicago's Gold Coast attempted to recalibrate their relationship with me by early December, sending $500 floral arrangements and invitations to gala dinners I had no intention of attending. They spoke of Elena's visionary leadership and the unfortunate situation with Julian, as if the $2.4 million laundering scheme were a minor weather event that had now passed. I responded to each invitation with a form letter from the Sterling Foundation, requesting a donation of exactly $45,000, the cost of Julian's typical bespoke suit, to fund our first youth housing unit. Most of the $1,000 an hour PR firms advised their clients to comply, and the $12.5 million estate's social capital was slowly converted into actual, tangible support for the invisible. I moved through these interactions with the cold, precise distance of a federal agent, never allowing the $5,000 tuxedos to forget the $12 orange jumpsuit Julian was currently wearing. I wasn't their new queen, I was their auditor. My mother eventually moved into a $12,500 a month studio apartment I secured for her, far from the $12.5 million North Shore manor but within walking distance of a quiet park. She sat on her modest sofa, her hands still searching for the $40,000 South Sea pearls, her eyes reflecting the same $50 bribe she had once pressed into my palm. I visited her every 2 weeks at precisely $2 p.m., bringing her the essentials and a small, prepaid allowance that was subject to a bi-weekly audit of her expenses. We didn't talk about the 14,000-square-foot house or the $1.8 billion portfolio Julian had burned. We talked about the weather and the birds in the park. I didn't feel the need to forgive or to forget the November storm. I simply maintained the $12.5 million distance that was necessary for my own structural integrity. She was a passenger I had saved, but she was no longer the pilot of my life. Julian's trial began on a Tuesday in January. The courtroom temperature held at a steady 68 degrees as the $2.4 million in kickbacks were detailed by the federal prosecution. I was the star witness, my voice a clinical B-flat resonance as I presented the 84 transfer receipts and the original will that Julian had tried to forge 16 years ago. He sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on his own empty wrist where the $85,000 Patek Philippe used to be, his jaw clenching every time I mentioned the $450,000 embezzlement. The $12,000 charcoal suit was a memory, replaced by a cheap polyester blazer that didn't quite hide the way his shoulders had collapsed under the weight of the evidence. His defense team tried to paint me as a vengeful sister, but I countered with the $2.4 million in documentary proof that didn't have an emotion in its body. The jury watched with the same clinical curiosity of people observing a controlled demolition. The verdict came at 3:45 p.m. on a Friday, the $150 gavel sounding with the finality of a $12.5 million debt being called in for full payment. Julian was sentenced to 10 years for laundering, wire fraud, and the $450,000 embezzlement. His $1.8 billion dream, now a decade-long reality of steel bars and concrete. He looked at me as the marshals led him away, his eyes wide with a question I had already answered 16 years ago at the Greyhound station. I didn't smile or look away. I simply recorded the 112 beats per minute in his neck and adjusted the silver heirloom brooch on my blazer. The atmospheric pressure in the courtroom didn't change for me. It had been calibrated by the cold, 11:14 p.m. sleet of my childhood, long before the first subpoena was ever served. He was a convicted felon, and I was the auditor who had closed the books on his fraud. The transformation of the Sterling Manor into the Sterling Foundation was completed by the following spring, its $12.5 million limestone walls now housing 32 teenagers who had been discarded by their own families. The $200,000 stained glass windows no longer reflected the $1.8 billion vanity of my father. They reflected the bright, chaotic energy of kids who were learning that their value wasn't a rounding error. I walked through the halls at 8 a.m. every morning, the smell of fresh paint and industrial floor wax a clinical confirmation of the work we were doing. I didn't feel the need to be their mother or their savior. I felt the satisfaction of a forensic auditor who had finally balanced the ledger of a broken family. The silver brooch was no longer a hidden key. It was a visible symbol of a legacy that chose transparency over the $45,000 marble balustrade. My heart was still a spreadsheet, but the numbers finally made sense. Julian's life in the state penitentiary was a study in the total depreciation of status. His world reduced to a 6-by-9-foot cell and a $12 orange jumpsuit. He spent his days in the laundry room, the $1.8 billion tycoon now responsible for cleaning the $5 polyester uniforms of his fellow inmates. He stopped writing the demanding letters after the first year. his $12,000 bespoke arrogance having been scrubbed away by the daily reality of a federal sentence. I didn't visit him, and I didn't send him the $45,000 he requested for a private legal review. I simply monitored his disciplinary reports with the clinical distance of a DOJ auditor. He wasn't a brother to be saved. He was a liability that had reached its final, zero-sum value. The memory of the $85,000 Patek Philippe was just a heat signature on a digital file, a $2.4 million reminder of the price of a lie. The Aliada Secreta, Aunt Sophia, became a legend within the Sterling Foundation. Her portrait, hanging in the library where the $15,000 Cartier watch she once wore was displayed in a glass case. The $25,000 trust she had left for my education was the seed that had grown into this $12.5 million sanctuary, a clinical proof that love can be a tactical strategy sent from the past. I often stood before her portrait at 5 p.m., the silver heirloom brooch cool against my chest, and thanked her for teaching me to find the truth hidden in the margins of a spreadsheet. She had seen the $450,000 rot in the family foundation long before I ever did, and she had spent her final years forging the weapon that would eventually dismantle it. Her legacy wasn't a gift of comfort, it was a gift of clarity, a $12.5 million reminder that the truth always demands its full seat at the table. My mother, Lydia, passed away in her sleep during the 3rd year of Julian's sentence, her $40,000 South Sea pearls having been replaced by a simple $50 silver cross I had bought for her. I handled her final arrangements with the same clinical precision I used for a federal audit, ensuring that the $2,500 expenses were covered and that she was buried far from the $12.5 million North Shore manor. She didn't leave a will or a $1.8 billion fortune. She left a small collection of $8,000 Chanel bags that were auctioned off to fund a scholarship in her name. I didn't cry at the funeral, but I did place the framed $50 bill in her casket, a final, zero-sum return of the only thing she had ever truly given me. The atmospheric pressure of our relationship was finally settled, a $12.5 million debt that was now marked as paid in full on the balance sheet of my life. The Sterling Foundation's first graduating class in 2024 was a collection of 32 success stories, each one a living proof that a rounding error can become the most important variable in an equation. I stood on the same mahogany stage where Julian had tried to humiliate me at the gala, looking out at a room full of people who were no longer invisible. The $200,000 floral arrangements were gone, replaced by the simple, vibrant decorations made by the kids themselves, and the $15,000 couture gowns were replaced by the proud $50 graduation robes. I didn't give a speech about the $12.5 million estate or the $2.4 million laundering scheme. I spoke about the importance of an internal audit and the power of the truth. My voice was calm and precise, the $1.8 billion noise of the past finally silenced by the $0 balance of my own conscience. Have you ever looked at the people who tried to destroy you and realized that they were actually the ones who gave you the tools to rebuild your own empire? I want you to think about the $50 bribes and the 11:14 p.m. storms in your own life. The moments when you were told you were a liability or a failure. What if those moments were just the raw data you needed to build a life that no one could ever forge or steal? Tell me in the comments. What is the silver brooch in your life? The thing that holds the key to your own truth. I'm reading every single story because I know what it's like to be the auditor of your own pain. Your comments are the community we are building here. A $12.5 million legacy of shared resilience that the Julian Sterlings of the world will never understand. We are the architects of the truth. The final audit of my own life was completed on my 36th birthday, a Tuesday in March when the temperature on the North Shore was a steady 45 degrees. I sat in my office at the Sterling Foundation, the weathered black leather audit case resting on the floor, and reviewed the final balance sheet of the $12.5 million estate. Every cent of the $450,000 Julian had stolen had been accounted for and redistributed, and the $2.4 million laundering scheme was now a series of closed federal files. I didn't feel the weight of the $1.8 billion past anymore. I felt the light, geometric clarity of a life that was finally in equilibrium. The silver heirloom brooch was no longer a weapon. It was a simple piece of jewelry that reflected the morning light. I was no longer Agent Sterling, the forensic auditor seeking a debt. I was Elena Sterling, the woman who had already paid it. Julian was released from the state penitentiary in 2030, a 60-year-old man with a $250 bus ticket and a $12.5 million memory of a life he had forged and lost. He didn't return to the North Shore manor. He moved into a tiny studio apartment on the South Side, the $1.8 billion tycoon now living on a fixed government allowance. He reached out to me once, a short email that didn't demand or beg, but simply asked if I could spare an hour of my time for a cup of coffee. I responded with the clinical precision of my training, informing him that my schedule was fully committed to the Sterling Foundation's new audit cycle. I didn't feel hatred or the need for a final, vengeful word. I simply didn't have any more variables to assign to his existence. He was a zero on my balance sheet, a $450,000 lesson that had been fully amortized. The $14,000 square foot limestone mansion eventually became a historic landmark in Chicago, a clinical reminder of the $12.5 million cost of familial pride and the power of a forensic audit. The Sterling Foundation moved into a more modern $5 million facility downtown, but the original manor remained as a museum of social justice and transparency. I often walked through the empty halls after the last tour had left, the $200,000 stained glass windows still casting their geometric shadows across the $300,000 Axminster carpet. The smell of expensive Arabica coffee was a ghost, replaced by the scent of time and the quiet satisfaction of a completed mission. I didn't look for the $1.8 billion past in the shadows. I looked at the silver brooch on my lapel and saw the future I had built from the ruins of a lie. The city of Chicago eventually awarded me a commendation for my work with the DOJ and the Sterling Foundation, a $150 plaque that meant more to me than the $12.5 million estate ever had. I stood at the podium in City Hall, the same clinical B-flat resonance in my voice, and accepted the honor on behalf of every rounding error who had ever refused to be erased. I didn't mention Julian's $2.4 million laundering scheme or the $450,000 embezzlement. I spoke about the $25,000 trust Aunt Sophia had left and the importance of looking for the truth in the margins of the world. The $15,000 couture gowns in the audience were still there, but they didn't intimidate me anymore. I was the auditor who knew exactly how they were financed. The atmospheric pressure of my life was finally calibrated to the truth. I spent my summers in a small $400,000 cottage on the coast of Maine, far from the $12.5 million noise of the North Shore and the $1.8 billion weight of the Sterling name. I sat on the porch at 7:00 p.m. every evening, the smell of salt and cedar replacing the scent of expensive Arabica coffee and industrial floor wax. I didn't have an $85,000 Patek Philippe to tell me the time. I had the rhythmic pulse of the ocean and the silver heirloom brooch that I now wore as a simple, elegant reminder of where I came from. My life was no longer a series of $450,000 calculations. It was a settled account, a balance sheet that had finally found its $0 balance of peace. I was no longer waiting for the next November storm. I had become the storm that cleared the air. The $50 bill in the plastic frame was eventually donated to the Sterling Foundation's museum, a clinical exhibit labeled The Price of Invisibility. It sat next to the $12,000 suit Julian had worn at the gala and the evidence bags containing his $85,000 Patek Philippe, a $1.8 billion collection of failures and frauds. I watched as the young people from the foundation looked at the bill, their eyes reflecting the same question I had once asked myself at the Greyhound station. I didn't give them a $12.5 million answer. I simply told them that the only thing that truly lasts is the truth they build for themselves. The bill wasn't a reminder of my mother's betrayal. It was a reminder of the day I decided that my value wasn't a fixed, negligible cost. It was the $50 start of a $12.5 million journey. By the time I reached 50, the Sterling Foundation had become a global model for transparent philanthropy, with a $1.8 billion endowment that was audited with the same clinical precision I had used at the DOJ. I was no longer the active director, but I remained the chief architect of reality, a title that Aunt Sophia would have appreciated. I spent my days in windowless rooms, not seeking $2.4 million in kickbacks, but teaching the next generation of auditors how to find the lies hidden in the $15,000 couture gowns and the $45,000 marble balustrades. My voice was still cold and distant, but it was also a steady, immutable anchor for those who were navigating their own November storms. I wasn't just a survivor of a $12.5 million theft. I was the witness who ensured it would never happen again. Julian passed away in 2045, alone in his Southside studio apartment with a $250 funeral provided by the state. He didn't leave a $1.8 billion legacy or a $12.5 million estate. He left a box of old photographs and a single forged document he had kept as a reminder of the life he once had. I didn't attend the funeral, and I didn't pay for a $15,000 mahogany casket. I simply signed the federal forms for his cremation and added his file to the closed section of the archive. The $450,000 debt he owed to me was finally settled, not with a check, but with the quiet, zero-sum finality of his departure. He was a variable that had finally been eliminated from the equation, a $2.4 million noise that was now an eternal silence. The silver heirloom brooch was passed down to the Foundation's most promising young auditor, a 22-year-old woman who had survived her own version of the 11:14 p.m. storm. I pinned it to her $150 blazer, with the same clinical precision Aunt Sophia had used in the attic 30 years ago. And I told her that knowledge is the only currency that never depreciates. She didn't look at the brooch with greed. She looked at it with the same $12.5 million clarity I had found at the Greyhound station. I knew then that the Sterling legacy was finally safe, not in the 14,000 square foot limestone walls, but in the heart of a new witness who understood the language of the truth. The audit was continuing, and I was finally ready to step away from the ledger. As I look back on the $12.5 million journey from that frozen Greyhound station to the quiet plateau of my retirement, I realized that the most important audit was always the one I performed on my own heart. I learned that you can't build a life on the $1.8 billion lies of other people, but you can build one on the $50 truth of your own resilience. I want you to remember that every time you feel like a rounding error, every time someone tries to tell you that your value is a fixed, negligible cost, you are the only auditor who can truly balance your own books. Thank you for being part of this $12.5 million story, for your comments, and for your own shared audits of reality. The best is yet to come, and I'm glad we reached this final balance together. The lakefront property where the manor once stood is now a public park, a $12.5 million gift to the people of Chicago that smells of fresh grass and the open, clinical air of the truth. I walk there sometimes at 6:12 a.m., watching the sunrise over Lake Michigan and feeling the cool, rhythmic pulse of the world. I don't look for the $85,000 Patek Philippe or the $12,000 suits in the shadows. I look at the people enjoying the $200,000 view for free, and I feel the satisfaction of a job well done. The Sterling name is no longer a social gold standard or a toxic liability. It's a simple word for a foundation built on transparency and the refusal to be erased. The atmospheric pressure is finally perfect, a $1.8 billion storm that ended in a $0 balance of peace. My life is no longer a drama of high-stakes galas and $2.4 million laundering schemes. It's a quiet, geometric series of days that I spend on my own terms. I have my $400,000 cottage, my $50 memories, and the clinical satisfaction of knowing that I was the one who balanced the Sterling ledger. I don't need the $45,000 marble balustrade to feel strong, and I don't need the $40,000 South Sea pearls to feel seen. I am the woman who stood in the 11:14 p.m. sleet and decided that the truth was the only empire worth building. I am the auditor of my own destiny, and for the first time in 60 years, the books are perfectly, immutably closed. As the sun dipped below the horizon at 7:14 p.m., casting long, geometric shadows across the now vibrant grounds of the Sterling Foundation, I sat on the same marble steps where I had once been pushed into the rain. The silver heirloom brooch felt light against my blazer, no longer a hidden key but a visible symbol of a legacy that chose truth over the $1.8 billion illusion. My life was no longer a series of defensive calculations or a search for the $450,000 Julian had stolen. It was a settled account, a balance sheet where every humiliation had been amortized by the weight of justice. I looked at the weathered black leather audit case resting beside me, its seams holding the quiet satisfaction of a job professionally executed. The world was still full of people who believed that power was found in the $85,000 Patek Philippe, but I knew better now. I knew that the only thing that truly lasts is the quiet, immutable strength of a witness who refused to be erased. It is 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in Maine, and the only sound in my small kitchen is the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a standard $40 electric kettle. I sit at a table made of reclaimed pine, the texture of the wood grain rough against my palms, smelling the sharp, honest aroma of local breakfast tea instead of the synthetic lilies of the Drake Hotel. My wrist is bare of any $85,000 Patek Philippe. I track the passage of time by the way the tide retreats from the gray granite rocks exactly 30 feet from my porch. The air is cool and smells of salt and balsam, a clinical purity that requires no $200,000 filtration system to maintain. I look at the silver heirloom brooch resting in a velvet box, its metallic glint now a soft, domestic sparkle rather than a weapon of federal seizure. I am not the daughter of a limestone empire or the sister of a convict. I am simply a woman who has reached a $0 balance with her history. The Sterling Foundation currently operates with a transparent $1.8 billion endowment, and every morning at 9 a.m., the digital audit logs show 42 separate transactions funding vocational training for the same kids Julian once considered statistically irrelevant. I don't visit the North Shore Manor anymore. The 14,000 square foot structure is now a public asset, where the smell of industrial floor wax and the sound of laughter have permanently replaced the suffocating silence of my childhood. I occasionally receive a clinical report on the maintenance of my mother's memorial scholarship, noting the $25,000 allocated for students who, like me, were once given a $50 bribe to stay invisible. The internal camera of my life no longer seeks out the $450,000 discrepancies or the $2.4 million laundering trails. I observe the way the light hits the white hydrangeas in my garden at a 45-degree angle, a simple, non-monetary beauty that no amount of embezzled capital could ever hope to manufacture or sustain. What I have learned in the 16 years since that November storm is that the most dangerous thing about a lie is not its complexity, but the arrogance of the person who believes it can withstand an audit. Julian believed that status was a physical shield, that an $85,000 watch could stop the gears of a DOJ investigation, and that a sister could be discarded like a rounding error without affecting the final sum. But the truth is a mathematical constant. It doesn't care about your $12,000 suits or the $45,000 marble balustrades you hide behind. If you are currently sitting in your own version of that 2:14 a.m. Greyhound station, feeling the cold weight of someone else's greed in your marrow, you already know what the elite in their $5,000 tuxedos will never understand. Power isn't found in the $12.5 million you steal. It is found in the clinical, immutable proof of who you are when everything else is stripped away. I am no longer Agent Sterling, the woman who turned her heart into a cold spreadsheet to survive the North Shore, and I am no longer the girl who memorized the smell of diesel at the Harrison Street station. I am the architect of a reality that is perfectly balanced, a legacy where the $50 bill and the silver brooch carry more weight than the $1.8 billion Julian burned in his vanity. As the evening light fades to a deep, clinical indigo over the Atlantic, I realize that the audit of a human life never truly ends. It just becomes a matter of public record. For those of you who have lived through your own structural failure, who have watched your own family build an empire on the theft of your future, I have one final question to close the books. When the noise of their lies finally stopped and the truth reclaimed the foundation, what was the first thing you built for yourself that they could never touch?